The committee will come to order. It's with real sadness and profound regret that I open the committee's review of the administration's international affairs budget request for fiscal year 2009. I had hoped that our departed friend and colleague, Chairman Tom Lantos, would take the gavel in hand to guide us today. Before we engage in this process, I'd like to ask everyone here today to stop and reflect on the man who, for the last year, has led our efforts to hold the executive branch to account while also holding together the committee's respected tradition of bipartisan cooperation, even when we disagree. The last 3 days have brought a cascade of tributes to our late friend, Tom Lantos, so many fine words coming from every quarter and corner of the world. They are the heartfelt outpourings of the mighty and the small, heads of state and the humble too, along with the legions of Tom and Annette Lantos's fellow laborers in the vineyard of human rights. Tom would have appreciated the eloquence of these countless accolades. He was so very well spoken himself. He would have reveled in the recognition of his hard work and that of his loving wife to build and to maintain the Congressional Human Rights Caucus over the last 24 years. And he would have been gratified yet humbled by the sweeping accounts of his legislative achievements in fields as diverse as nuclear nonproliferation, environmental protection, and international scholarly exchange. And of course, history will remember Tom for his unwavering support of Israel and the U.S.-Israel relationship. His life experience instilled in him a deep and abiding commitment to that tiny state, an island of democracy and a true partner of our country. So please join me in a moment of silence to remember our friend and cherished colleague, the late and much-loved chairman of this committee, and a moral force whose voice will be terribly missed, Congressman Tom Lantos. I also want to mention that Chairman Lantos attracted a wonderful staff, both in his personal office and on his committee. Their long service and their outstanding work bear testament to his leadership, and I want to express my condolences to them as well as to his family. And now on the business at hand, in the bipartisan spirit of rigorous and responsible oversight befitting the memory of Chairman Lantos, we welcome Madam Secretary. I strongly support, Madam Secretary, the administration's overall international affairs budget request for fiscal year 2009. It surpasses current spending by nearly $3 billion, a welcome turn of events. In his 2002 National Security Strategy, President Bush elevated the importance of diplomacy and development to be on a par with defense. Nobody believes they will be funded equally, but we should strike a better balance than we now have. The budget that funds the State Department and the U.S. Agency for International Development absolutely pales in comparison to what is requested for the Department of Defense. The irony in this imbalance is that the international affairs budget contributes directly to U.S. national security. The programs it funds help fight terrorism, prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and enhance the safety of our embassies around the world. The budget also funds an array of vital programs to promote democracy, human rights, and the rule of law, to assist U.S. businesses abroad, and to provide critical assistance to those suffering from extreme poverty in the poorest places in the world. And yet this budget typically comprises just 1% of total federal spending. This new budget request starts to address the reality that we have been far too slow to face. Our civilian agencies are woefully unprepared to handle the unprecedented global security challenges confronting the U.S. today. Here's just one example. A study just released by the RAND Corporation shows that despite the common notion that civil capabilities and military power are equally important to counterinsurgency operations overseas. The meager and infrequent bump-ups in the State Department budget have been dwarfed by massive increases in Pentagon spending. The report goes on to note, and I'm quoting here, if Islamic insurgency is the gravest threat to the United States and its interests in the near to middle term, and if countering this insurgency requires a broad and balanced array of capabilities, the grim implication is that the United States is ill-equipped to counter the gravest threat it faces. With increasing frequency, our men and women in uniform have been filling the gap in civilian capacity in our reconstruction and stabilization projects overseas. Combatant commanders and field artillerymen are building schools, mentoring city councils, usually without the needed language skills or long-term training for this ambitious work. As Secretary of Defense Gates has aptly observed, it is no replacement for the real thing, civilian involvement and expertise. The need for this expertise will only become more pronounced as many experts agree that the United States will be engaged in more, not fewer, operations that affect our national security. One last point on the substance of this. The request for the peacekeeping account is based on an overly optimistic assumption, and it really is, to my way of thinking, absurdly low. At $1.5 billion, the fiscal year 2009 request is $800 million below what the administration is spending on UN peacekeeping this year. With the ramp-up of the UN mission in Darfur, the situation in Chad, the anticipated need to sustain robust forces in Lebanon, Congo, Liberia, Southern Sudan, Ivory Coast, and Haiti, we can anticipate a sharp increase in the overall UN peacekeeping budget and the operations that support so many U.S. interests. Madam Secretary, we look forward to hearing from you about how the Department of State intends to meet all of our country's foreign responsibilities, from stabilization to peacekeeping to increasing the diplomatic ranks. And before I turn to Ms. Ross-Leighton, I want to acknowledge our newest colleague, Mr. Rob Whitman of Virginia. As we all know, Mr. Whitman recently joined the House after the special election for the seat occupied by our colleague and former member of this committee, Ms. Joanne Davis. I want to extend a warm welcome from all our members on this side of the aisle to Mr. Whitman. Welcome. And now I yield to my friend, the distinguished ranking member, Ms. Ross-Leighton.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And let me start also by expressing our great sadness at the loss earlier this week of our beloved chairman and our great friend to all, Tom Lantos. And I know that he enjoyed a warm friendship with Madam Secretary as well. We all knew Tom to be a gracious man of great courage, a natural leader of unimpeachable character. He was loved and respected on both sides of the aisle. He set a high standard for himself and devoted himself to making the world a better place than the one he found. And we will surely miss him. And thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the statements that all of us made last night, and we look forward to the wonderful celebration of Tom's life tomorrow at 10 a.m. at Statuary Hall. And turning to today's hearing, Mr. Chairman, there are certainly many troubling developments in the present that concern us all, but I would like to note a few that are of particular importance to me. Nuclear proliferation, heading the list is this topic, the accelerating speed of the capacity to make nuclear weapons. And nowhere is this more dramatic than in the Middle East, where country after country have expressed their intent to pursue their own nuclear program. Virtually none of the projects can be justified in terms of economic terms, and it defies logic to attribute this sudden rush to a newfound concern over global warming. The threat to the world's security is obvious. In an age where the nuclear fuel is in a typical reactor can be used in so-called dirty bombs, even the full range of international controls and inspections cannot provide an acceptable margin of safety. So it is critically important that the United States and other countries, especially France and Russia, which have been so active in promoting their nuclear ties to Iran, pause and consider the consequences of developments in this region before agreeing to bilateral nuclear cooperation agreements with all of those countries in the region. In North Korea, Mr. Chairman and Madam Secretary, our current efforts to persuade that country to give up its nuclear weapons program has encountered one obstacle after another. I believe that we are in danger of repeating the errors of the past. It surprises me greatly to point to Libya as a guide for anything, but our success in ridding that country of unconventional weapons provides some useful and timely lessons. And our success, led by our chairman, Tom Lantos, was rooted in a refusal to compromise with the regime until it first completely and verifiably dismantled, not suspended, dismantled its chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons facilities. Only after it had stopped to threaten the world did the U.S. begin to remove the sanctions and offer it any sort of legitimacy. Given this example, we've got to be careful in our approach to the regime in North Korea and take full note of Admiral McConnell's judgment regarding North Korea's intentions. Last week, he said, he's told the Senate Intelligence Committee, while Pyongyang denies a program for uranium enrichment and they deny their proliferation activities, we believe that North Korea continues to engage in both. He further noted, we remain concerned North Korea could proliferate nuclear weapons abroad. So, Madam Secretary, I reiterate previous commitments that my colleagues and I made of the administration to provide full briefing for members of this committee and for Congress as a whole, not just on the six-party talks, but also on the reported Israeli strike on a Syrian facility with suspected North Korean ties. And we look forward to a positive response on this request. And of course, Iran's determination to lay the foundation for a nuclear weapons program poses the greatest threat to the world's security. We thank you, Madam Secretary, for your efforts to persuade members of the UN Security Council to strengthen sanctions against the regime in Tehran. The provision in the current draft in the Security Council resolution encouraging active measures by all countries to prevent their citizens and their businesses from supporting Iran's nuclear missile program is very welcome. Another important provision is the one relating to the inspection of cargo bound for Iran. This parallels the administration's very successful PSI, Proliferation Security Initiative, that has steadily increased its effectiveness over the past few years. We have intercepted vessels carrying materials or proliferation concerns. And I hope that this new UN mandate will have the same impact, the same effect that the enforcement of sanctions against Iran. And currently, those sanctions that are being undermined, for example, by the transshipment of banned goods through the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, among other countries, and that for that reason, I and several other members of this committee have sent a letter to Director McConnell asking for an assessment of the effectiveness of UAE's export control regime, especially regarding Iran. On China and Russia, they continue to engage in policies that help Iran's nuclear missile program, and they've become major arms merchants in the region. And I urge you, Madam Secretary, to make it clear again to the Russian and Chinese governments, including through the implementation of full range of U.S. laws, that we regard these shipments to be a direct threat to our interest. On the China Olympics, Madam Secretary, although some see Beijing as becoming a responsible stakeholder in an international system, China's actions demonstrate something completely different. And I regret that the Olympics are being held in the capital of a country that does not respect the human rights of its own population. And it's dangerous to Americans as well. I hope that you consider issuing a travel advisory to warn U.S. citizens traveling to Beijing about the Chinese regime's actions against anyone who's expressing support for democracy. On the broader issue of Darfur, Madam Secretary, thank you in selecting Ambassador Williamson as our new special envoy. I've had the opportunity of meeting with him, and I hope that we can make progress regarding the deployment of the hybrid force. And turning lastly to our hemisphere, many of us are increasingly concerned about Iran's growing presence and influence throughout the region, especially its cooperation with Cuba and Venezuela. And in my letter to you last week, Madam Secretary, I requested that the administration investigate whether a recently reported petrochemical sector agreement between the governments of Venezuela and Iran violates U.S. law. Since that letter was sent, I have learned that a Venezuela-owned bank, Banco Industrial de Venezuela, headquarters in Caracas, has been operating branches in my district, in Miami, in Havana, and Tehran. And I ask that any investigation be expanded to include this new information to make sure that U.S. laws concerning Iran and Cuba are fully enforced. And on the issue of Afghanistan and Pakistan, we know about the ceasefire. How does this fit into the bilateral counterterrorism efforts, and what does it mean when viewed within the context of Monday's capture of the Taliban militia leader? We have a pending issue about the U.S. victims of Palestinian terrorism, and so far the PA and the PLO have refused to pay those judgments of those U.S. victims, and recent reports indicate that State Department may issue a statement in favor of the PA efforts to avoid paying hundreds of millions of dollars in judgments won by American victims in U.S. courts, and I would hope that that would not happen. Thank you for your help with PEPFAR and with the Civilian Reserve Corps bill. I know that those are two issues that are very important to you. And Mr. Berman, our chairman, has been helpful in trying to get an agreement concerning PEPFAR. I hope that we were able to do that, and I thank the chairman for his willingness to keep that conversation and that dialogue going. And I would appreciate hearing from you about PEPFAR and the Counselor Corps as well. And thank you to Rob Whitman. Welcome. Bienvenido. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Ross-Layton. And now we expect there'll be votes around 3 o'clock, so let's go to your testimony, and then under the procedures that have been established in the committee, members will get to question you if, in the order that they were the ones here at the time of the gavel first. Madam Secretary.
Thank you very much, Chairman Berman. Thank you very much, Ranking Member Ross-Layton. Now on, I think.
A little closer.
It's on. Is it
Okay.
not?
Closer, I think.
You may have a technical problem with it. Is it now working? No. We have another mic because, or I can try to speak very loud. Does that help?
Yeah.
Let's. Darned if I know what to do.
It's working for the stenographer. Is that now?
We can hear you.
All right. Shall I proceed?
Yes.
Chairman? All right. First of all, let me join you in expressing my great sadness at the loss of our good friend and colleague, Congressman Tom Lantos. Not only has he been a good friend and a mentor here in Washington, he is someone that I knew during my time as a professor at Stanford. I think it's fair to say he was a true American hero. He really represented all that is best in our country. He's going to be greatly missed. I feel personally that I have lost a great and inspirational mentor, and we've certainly all lost a very good friend. And to his wonderful family and to all of his colleagues, my condolences. Mr. Chairman, with your permission, I have a longer statement which I'll ask to be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Make a few remarks. I want to thank you for the opportunity to appear before the committee today in support of the President's fiscal year 2009 International Affairs budget request. This is the last time that I will come to the committee as Secretary of State for a budget. I want to thank you very much for the excellent support that this committee has provided to the Department of State. Even if we've not always agreed on matters of policy, we we have certainly, I think, been able in a spirit that would have made the founders very proud to have our differences, but to continue to promote the values and the interests of the United States for a freer and more prosperous world. I want to note in particular that we've made a lot of progress over the last several years, and I very much attribute that to the bipartisan support of my authorizing and appropriations committees. We have been trying to rebuild the capability of the State Department and the civilian side. I think we all recognize that the 1990s was a time of perhaps cashing in on a peace dividend that turned out on the morning of 2001 to show us that it had been premature to think about a peace dividend. And in fact, thanks to the help of this committee, we've been able to increase foreign assistance by doubling it for Latin America, tripling it worldwide, quadrupling it for Africa. We've had the important initiatives of the President's Emergency Program for HIV and AIDS, for malaria. We have had the innovative new approach of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which has helped us to reward the work of governments that are trying to govern wisely and to invest in their people. We, of course, have increased significantly the resources going to public diplomacy. Public diplomacy is going to have to be rebuilt over an extended period of time, but I think we've made great progress. We have increased again the number of foreign students who are studying in this country. After September 11th, those numbers collapsed to very low numbers, and I think that those of us who look to the long term know that when students from abroad get to know us and spend time here, and when our students get to go abroad, that is really the very best way for people to get to know America and to spread our values. We've also made important changes to the way that the department operates. I made the decision that we needed to change to redeploy our people out of, many of them out of Europe and into growing places like India and Brazil and to China. It was the fact that we had almost as many Foreign Service officers in Germany as we had in India. It seemed important to have that redeployment. But even with those redeployments, it is absolutely the case that the Foreign Service is too small. Secretary Powell was able to redress some of the problems of the freezes in hiring that happened in the 1990s by increasing over 4 years 2,000 Foreign Service officers. The President in this budget has asked for approximately 1,100 Foreign Service officers, as well as 300 people for USAID. And I think it is very important that we rebuild this civilian strength. In that regard, we are asking our men and women to do things that were perhaps not expected for the Foreign Service. They're working in provincial reconstruction teams in Iraq and Afghanistan, supporting local and provincial development that I think is paying dividends in the stabilization of those countries. They are working far away from capitals in remote areas, delivering assistance, helping people to develop. And in that regard, the request that we fund fully the civilian response corps, to which Congressman Ross Layton referred, is really for us a major step forward in restructuring the way that we think about reconstruction and development. I think it's fair to say that we, in post-conflict societies, we tried it one way in Afghanistan, which was what I'll refer to as the adopt a ministry approach, with many, many different countries being involved. We appreciate very much that a lot of countries were involved, but frankly, we're still paying for some of the incoherence of that effort. In Iraq, we tried to do reconstruction by putting it under a single department, the Defense Department, which I think everybody there would say we were not fully able to mobilize the civilian capabilities that were needed for reconstruction. And the truth is, we really did not have, either in any department or in the U.S. government as a whole, an institution that could really deal with post-conflict stabilization. And yet, whether it is the major efforts in places like Iraq or Afghanistan, or smaller efforts in places like Liberia or Haiti, or we hope one day to help reconstruct a democratic Cuba, it is going to be necessary that we have the civilians who can do that. And the Civilian Response Corps will allow Americans to dedicate themselves for a year or so to taking their skills as city planners or as people in rule of law or as health experts and go and help to spread prosperity. Because the final point that I'd like to make is that very clearly this administration has focused very heavily on the importance of uniting our interests and our values. While sometimes people may think that our values and our interests are in conflict in the short term, I'm a deep believer that they can never be in conflict in the long run. If America does not stand for freedom and for liberty, for human rights, for the rights of the oppressed, and if we don't believe that there's no corner of the earth which should be condemned to tyranny, then nobody will. And the ability to use our foreign assistance to structure our foreign policy in a way that we can help to spread those benefits is not only our moral obligation and shows the compassionate side of America, but it is clearly deeply in our interest and will make us a more secure country in the long run. So thank you very much over the years for the support of this committee, and I'm very pleased to take your questions.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. I'll recognize myself first for 5 minutes. Director of National Intelligence Mike McConnell testified last week that Iran's nuclear program remains a serious potential threat. He stated, we remain concerned about Iran's intentions and assess with moderate to high confidence that Tehran, at a minimum, is keeping open the option to develop nuclear weapons. He also emphasized, and I'll quote again, declared uranium enrichment efforts which will enable the production of fissile material continue. This is the most difficult challenge in nuclear production. Madam Secretary, I do have a question on another subject after this, but so if you keep that in mind in your answer, but do you concur with Director McConnell's basic assessment that Iran may have suspended but not terminated its nuclear weapons program? Does Congress and do the American people have reason to be worried about Iran's continuing efforts to enrich uranium? And in your view, is Iran determined to acquire a nuclear weapons capability?
I believe that Iran is a great danger, both for its nuclear ambitions and for its support of terrorism around the world and the way it treats its own people. I'm very concerned, and I think Director McConnell was trying to make clear that while the NIE talked about suspension of an element of the Iranian program, the troubling elements of both the delivery vehicles, delivery systems, this continued work, and most importantly, the enrichment and reprocessing, which is the key to building fissile materials, is a great danger to us, yes.
In December of 2006, Congress passed the Hyde Act, named after our former chairman, Henry Hyde, established a framework for civilian nuclear cooperation with India. That legislation, negotiated in great detail with the administration, included a number of important provisions to help preserve the integrity of the global non-proliferation regime. The bill terminates U.S. nuclear cooperation with India if New Delhi resumes nuclear testing. It restricts the transfer of sensitive enrichment and reprocessing technologies, and has a number of other features. Before we take up the 123 agreement, you have the IAEA safeguards issue and the Nuclear Suppliers Group, which must approve a special exemption that allows member states, including the United States, to engage in nuclear trade with India. I'm concerned about the NSG. As I understand it, the U.S. representative to that body has circulated a clean exemption for India that doesn't reflect any of the restrictions contained in the Hyde Act. If that exemption were adopted by the NSG, we would essentially be creating two standards for nuclear trade for India, one for the United States and one for the rest of the world. It would seem to me that would undermine our non-proliferation goals and create a strong incentive for India to purchase nuclear technology. Isn't it in the national interest of the United States purchase technology from Russia and from France? Isn't it in the interest of the United States to push the NSG to adopt an exemption for India that includes and follows the restrictions of the Hyde Act?
Well, we will support nothing with India in the NSG, Congressman, that is in contradiction to the Hyde Act. It will have to be completely consistent with the obligations of the Hyde Act. India is sui generis in that, and that's why we needed
So is the
a
Hyde
special
Act.
bill. But everything that we do will be consistent with the Hyde Act.
Well, if I understand if you intend your answer to be what I understand, then
Yeah. We'll have to be consistent with the Hyde Act, or I don't believe we can count on the Congress to take the next step.
Gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Secretary. I wanted to ask about the Israeli-Palestinian issue. So I'll ask a few questions and await your response. Reports indicate that the recent destruction of the border wall between Egypt and the Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip enabled significant numbers of weapons and Iranian-trained terrorists to enter Gaza, and this follows Egypt's continuing failure to stop terrorist smuggling of money, of weapons, and people through tunnels going in and out of Gaza. Therefore, regarding the administration's suggested conditions for the provisions of $1.3 billion in foreign military financing to Egypt, would you agree that the administration should not waive the condition that Egypt must first take concrete and measurable steps to detect and destroy the smuggling networks and tunnels that lead from Egypt to Gaza? And continuing with that, in light of that recent destruction of the border wall, does the administration believe that Egypt's role vis-a-vis Gaza should change, particularly regarding the provision of food and energy? And lastly, Madam Secretary, regarding U.S. provision of non-lethal security assistance to the Palestinian Authority, could you comment on what monitoring mechanisms are in place to ensure that such assistance does not go to members of the Palestinian security services who belong to terrorist organizations, including Fatah's Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade? Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you, Congressman Layton. First of all, on Egypt and the Gaza, I think it's fair to say that the Egyptians have had a rather hard lesson about the Gaza recently. It is not in Egypt's interest to have had the breaching of that wall. They have tried to reestablish security, including at Rafah. We do believe that there will need to be some more permanent arrangement, perhaps involving Egypt, possibly even the PA and possibly European monitors, but there are many details that will need to be worked out. But I think you would find the Egyptians very concerned at what happened on that border and recognizing that it was not in their interest to have that happen. We also have worked through the Army Corps of Engineers to help them identify ways that they might deal with the tunnels. I think it's fair to say that we've not been satisfied with Egypt's effort on the tunnels, but that in fact those tunnels have been there for a long time, and it's been hard to stop smuggling whoever was trying to deal with that. We're in conversation with the Egyptians as well as the Israelis about how that might be done better. As to the $1.3 billion, we believe that this is aid that is important to maintaining Egypt's security forces. We appreciate the flexibility that was provided in the waiver, and I would just reserve to look at the cases as they come to me. But I think it would be important to note that we do have very intensive discussions going on with the Egyptians, as do the Israelis, about how both to manage that border and how to deal with Gaza more generally. Gaza is not going to, the status quo there, I think, is not sustainable. And so we're going to try to look for a solution that involves all parties. With the exception of, by the way, I just want to be clear, we have no intention of talking to Hamas about this. They have caused the problem. People are now trying to deal with the problem that Hamas caused. We've also been very clear that one of the answers has to be to stop the rocket attacks against Israel from Gaza. As to the PA forces, General Dayton has put together a security plan. The funding provided is to be used in accordance with that kind of classical train and equip plan. There is vetting of the people who would be involved in that. I would just note that it is new territory for us in the training of Palestinian security forces. But if the alternative is to have Hamas's forces well trained by Iranian backing, which is really where that is coming from, and not to have Abu Mazen have trained forces, then I think we have to try to move in this direction. We're trying to do it responsibly. We're doing it with as best vetting as we possibly can. And we've gotten good cooperation, by the way, from the Israelis as well in helping General Dayton in his mission.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And a gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Ackerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sure the committee will be afforded ample opportunity at some appropriate time to express our thoughts about former Congressman Lantos, but allow me at this moment just to say thank you to yourself for the very difficult task that's before you, and thank you for assuming the role of leadership of our committee. I'm sure you will prove, as you always do, to be thorough, thoughtful, and fair. Madam Secretary, I have two questions. The first is based on the op-ed piece that appeared in this morning's Washington Post by you and Secretary Gates. I assume it was occasioned by the widespread concern in Congress over what the future commitments to Iraq President Bush intends to make in the twilight of his presidency. I would like to ask you to reiterate for the record before the committee the 4 no's contained in that piece, as well as hopefully your pledge to consult closely with us and to provide complete transparency as the negotiations with Iraq go forward.
Thank you. Yes, I can very firmly say that it is not our intention to seek permanent bases. It is not our intention to undertake security commitments to Iraq that would lead us to...
Excuse me, when you say it is not your intention, would you say we will not?
We are not seeking permanent bases. The commitment is also, there's no commitment to combat forces, there's no commitment to troop levels. I think the way to best think about this agreement is that we have a number of SOFAs around the world. The Iraqis have wanted a more normal relationship. The UN Security Council resolution right now is the way that we legally maintain our forces in Iraq. We need a basis going forward, and that is what this is intended to do.
Tomorrow, Madam Secretary, as you know, is the 3rd anniversary of Rafiq Hariri's assassination, and our friends in Lebanon are under enormous pressure from the enemies of a free and democratic Lebanon to agree to a presidential candidate acceptable to Syria, as well as to concede to Hezbollah's ever-increasing demands for seats in the Lebanese president's cabinet. My question is, what are we going to do to put pressure on Syria and Hezbollah, and will you confirm for the committee that the administration has no intention of making a deal with Syria over the special tribunal established to investigate the Hariri assassination?
I can absolutely confirm we have no interest, intention, any such thing to make a deal with Syria. What we're trying to do is to help get the tribunal funded. I hope that there will be a positive announcement about the funding of that tribunal very soon, and we're working with the Arab states to try to help the Lebanese resolve their political crisis on the basis of what March 14th has found acceptable.
And the issue of pressuring Hezbollah?
Yes, we're working with the Arab states to do that. We've also, as you may note, made some other designations of Syrian personalities. And again, I think the best thing we could do is get this tribunal funded and make very clear that it's going to go forward.
Final question. On Monday, Pakistanis go to the polls to elect a new parliament. Recent opinion polls indicate that the opposition parties are likely to constitute the overwhelming majority in the next parliament. Well, all of us want free and fair elections in Pakistan, all of us, that is, except President Musharraf, who is unlikely to benefit from that circumstance. I think, however, that most of us would concede that the question isn't whether the elections are flawed, but how badly. If the administration cannot say that the elections are free and fair, will you at that point finally conceive that President Musharraf is not the indispensable man, but in fact a liability?
Well, we've been very focused on the elections, and elections that will be free and fair, and elections that will be credible to the Pakistani people. That's been the goal. There will be many European observers there. We will obviously have our people from our consulates and our embassies out and around. We will see what happens in the election, but we have encouraged that the moderates should come together after those elections to form a government that can govern Pakistan from the center. I think it's fair to say that we believe that President Musharraf, in taking off his uniform, made an important step, that he lifted a state of emergency, which we had believed was a mistake to begin with, but it was lifted. And now it is really the judgment of the Pakistani people that is being awaited. But we are asking that everybody at the time of the elections refrain from violence and try to resolve any differences politically.
Thank you.
The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, on January 30th, the New York Times reported on the recent arrest of a 34-year-old Chinese dissident named Hu Jia. Mr. Hu's crime, using his home computer to disseminate information on human rights cases. He joins, as you know, a huge, ever-growing number of dissidents, including cyber dissidents, who are today being hauled off to jail simply for espousing democracy and basic human rights. The Times article suggests the obvious. In the run-up to the Beijing Olympics in August, the PRC is attempting to crush all dissent. And as you know, China today is an egregious violator of human rights. Torture is endemic. Forced abortion is pervasive as a means of enforcing the government's draconian one-child per couple policy, a policy that has made brothers and sisters illegal and has led to gendercide, the annihilation of millions and millions and millions of girls simply because they're girls. Human trafficking is getting worse. There's no freedom of speech, assembly, and labor rights don't exist. My question is, in the run-up to the Olympics, and the fact that there are export controls on some things like handcuffs, fingerprint detection materials and the like, post-Tiananmen Square, the new technologies that are being employed that are going directly to the police from companies like Cisco, Honeywell, IBM, GE, and United Technologies include routers to monitor internet communications and pinpoint the exact computer on which a government critic is writing so that he can be detained moments after hitting or clicking send, software to analyze images captured on cameras in public places to identify suspicious gatherings like conferences or protests, and software to intercept mobile phone communications and identify the location of the caller. What can be done, in your view, to prevent the sale of these technologies, particularly right now when so many people will want to make contact with the athletes and with the press, especially with the press, in August in the during the Olympic Games, so that, again, the Chinese government does not reap a new bonanza of human rights dissidents that they send to the Laogai, where they will be tortured and harassed and abused?
Well, I can't comment, Congressman, on any specific cases that you're referring to, but I can say that, of course, the United States has stood for the right of people to use the Internet and to use it freely, because we believe it's a really great tool for democratization. Frankly, it's been a tool for some not great things as well, and I think we all recognize that, but that is one of the prices of liberty. What we've done is that when these cases have come up, we've been very, very active with the Chinese government to seek information, to try to make sure that these cases are not swept under the rug. I raise them with my counterpart. We raise them at very high levels. We want also not just to be in the business of raising specific cases, but we believe that we need to work structurally so that some of the laws and institutions that are used in China to these purposes should be undone, which is why we've made our human rights dialogue more focused on structural elements, as you know, as you and I have discussed before. I do think that in the run-up to the Olympics, China will be under considerable spotlight as well. And it is a time when these cases will be more evident and can be brought to the fore. So that is what we're trying to do. I don't know about specific equipment. One wants to be careful about too many restrictions on the very kinds of equipment that ultimately I think are going to undo authoritarian regimes, because government may think that it's controlling the internet or having an effect. I think in many places we're seeing that it's having quite the opposite effect.
I would ask if you could, the Global Online Freedom Act has passed out of this committee, is making its way through other committees of Congress. We would very much welcome the support of the administration for that legislation. Again, the new means by which governments can control and suppress and literally crush dissidents very often are of the high-tech variety. And as we're seeing right now, with impunity, the Chinese government is using that technology. You know, handcuffs obviously have dual use in the hands of a legitimate police force or in the hands of a secret police with nefarious purposes. But we have a situation today, Madam Secretary, where they're taking this Cisco, PoliceNet, state-of-the-art capabilities. A secret police now has it, and they're using it, and they're crushing dissent. We saw in the I saw in the Telegraph of London a report that the British athletes, and I think it's an accurate story, are not going to speak ill of any Chinese human rights policy and our in a way of like prior restraint broadcasting. They will say nothing about human rights. You know, I hope our athletes certainly don't do such a thing and will look to freely talk to dissidents and raise these issues. But this high-tech capability in the hands of a dictatorship will wreak unbelievable havoc and damage on the part of the dissidents. So we need to do something immediately.
The time of the gentleman has expired, and the gentleman from American Samoa, Mr. Falimavenga.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Is this mic working? Madam Secretary, it's always a pleasure to offer my personal welcome to you whenever you appear to testify before this committee. Thank you for your service to our nation, and I wish you continued good health and strength to carry out such a tremendous responsibility you bear in conducting our nation's foreign policies throughout the world. Forgive me for my voice. Madam Secretary, I have just returned from a trip to New Zealand, and I want to thank and to compliment you and the members of your staff in implementing a pilot program concerning the visa application program. You know, New Zealand's only about 2,500 miles from my district, and the thousands of my constituents have had to carry a very heavy financial burden in doing this. Thank you, and I sincerely want to thank our ambassador and our consul general there for their service. I also want to convey the best wishes of our mutual friend, the Foreign Minister of New Zealand, Mr. Winston Peters. And in my collaboration with him, Madam Secretary, he simply reconfirmed the concerns that I have expressed over the years. The fact that our country is not giving enough attention to the needs and the problems of the Pacific region. No presence of the USAID in the Pacific region. I recently introduced legislation that the State Department should establish presence of USAID in the Pacific. It's passed the House, and I sincerely hope that I will get your support in this effort. I had also visited recently Cambodia, Madam Secretary, and I was deeply moved by the experience. My subcommittee will be conducting a hearing on the question of forgiveness or recycling of Cambodia's debt or debt obligations, which now runs well over $300 million, to the U.S. supposedly have accrued for the 5-year period during the time of the Khmer Rouge, which ruled Cambodia. And knowing that the Khmer Rouge is one of the most brutal regimes of the 20th century, was responsible for torturing, slaughtering, and murdering some 1.7 million Cambodians out of only a population of 7 million people. And knowing also that Cambodia was left with only 69 intellectuals to rebuild its ruined economy, knowing also that the U.S. policy at the time, in part, led to the rise of the Khmer Rouge, which brought about Cambodia's destruction. Do you think the United States, our government, should in good conscience demand such repayment of such a debt when Cambodia was going through such a difficult time during the time of the Khmer Rouge? I wanted to ask for your response to that, Madam Secretary, the question of Cambodia.
Well, obviously, we consider very important the developments in Cambodia, but of course, we've been disappointed thus far in some of the efforts at reform in Cambodia, and we continue to press for those reforms. We've made available assistance, democracy assistance and the like in Cambodia, and we'll continue to watch it, Congressman. I take your point about the debt issue. I will have to look into it and get back to you. But we have tried to engage the government of Cambodia. We have tried to engage NGOs there. We would like to see a further progress of economic reform and democratization there. If I could turn for a moment back to the Pacific and particularly to New Zealand, we very much value the increased activity, increased interaction with New Zealand, and the increased and improved relationship with New Zealand. As you know, Prime Minister Clark has been here to see the President. Winston Peters and I are close colleagues, and we talk frequently. And I think our relationship there has improved. And again, I will look at the bill that you are looking at in terms of USAID and what might be done there.
Thank you, Madam Secretary.
Thank you. The gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher.
Thank you very much, Madam Secretary. Welcome. And obviously, you join with us today, and we all feel this is one of those days. Quite frankly, first meeting without Tom Lantos, and he was one of my real heroes. I mean, he really was. I probably have a list of 5 heroes of my life, and he was one of them. And I certainly want to go on the record as making sure everybody knows just how much he was appreciated here from this member of Congress over the years. But now it's all up to us. You know, it's just like when Ronald Reagan was around, we all depended on Ronald Reagan. Now Tom Lantos isn't going to be around, and it's even more of a responsibility for those of us not to forget those fundamental principles which guided Tom Lantos's priorities. And he had a set of priorities that I think were so admirable, and on the top of that list was human rights, and that should have a bearing on U.S. foreign policy. So first of all, I'd like to get your reaction, Madam Secretary, to Steven Spielberg's withdrawal from his participation in the Beijing Olympics on humanitarian and in terms of Darfur and human rights grounds. Should the United States not have a stand about the Beijing Olympics?
I believe that Mr. Spielberg has made a decision as a private citizen. I think he should do that. I think the role of the United States here is not to make judgments about who participates in the Olympics or not, but to continue to stand for the very concerns that we have about human rights and freedoms in China, and to use the opportunity to continue to promote those.
I have found, whether it was the Clinton administration or this administration, that the human rights considerations in dealing with China have not played a high priority, as Mr. Lantos would want it to have played. On another area, how much money are we asking for, is the administration requesting for Afghan reconstruction?
Well, we have, let's see, in the 09 budget, let me get those numbers for you, because there's an 09 budget request, and then there's about $800 million that is also in the supplemental for Afghanistan. And so all total, it's about $1 billion that is being requested.
I think that we have been just inexcusably lax in our commitment to rebuilding Afghanistan. And I think that's one of the reasons why we have problems there today, is we did not fulfill our promise to the Afghan people. I think it's very difficult for me as a member of Congress to take seriously when this administration claims that we are doing everything we can to help the Afghans to rebuild, when they are asking for so little money in reconstruction as compared to, for example, AIDS and malaria for Africa. I heard the President's address. He's asking for $6 billion a year for something that's a totally humanitarian project versus, as you were saying, $1 billion a year for a project that is so vital to our national security.
Congressman, I think our commitment to Afghanistan over the last 6 years has nearly been $20 billion. I would note that
That's reconstruction and military, or just
no, in terms of, it was $14 billion in terms of reconstruction before a significant infusion of almost $5 billion last year. So we've put a lot of money into reconstruction in Afghanistan. But I think that I was just there. I was just in Kandahar. I was just in Kabul. And where we've tried to concentrate our resources is in, first, the construction of roads. This is a country with no infrastructure. And in the provision of electrical power to the population, again, dealing with the infrastructure problem. One of the issues that I think we have, I referred to it in my opening remarks, is that the United States has been very generous in reconstruction assistance. In fact, there has been some considerable generosity from the international community as well, but I think it's not well coordinated. And I think our ability to go into a region, clear it of terrorists, hold it, and then reconstruct it is in part what is the problem here.
I would suggest one thing, and I'm running out of time here, just that we do have alternatives that we have not used, and there is a herbicide that we have talked about on numerous occasions that we have not used to eliminate the poppy production. Just like in the potato famine, the only crop that was affected by that fungus was the potatoes. All the other crops were fine. We could eliminate the poppy production in Afghanistan. And quite frankly, I've been pushing for this for probably 6 years now, and we haven't moved one step forward, I believe, in testing it. Am I wrong, or has the State Department finally agreed to test that herbicide?
I think this is a conversation we would need to have in another setting.
Okay,
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne.
Thank you very much. Good to see you, and might remind you that it was in 1980 that the U.S. did boycott the Olympics when Russia, USSR, invaded Afghanistan, and I think that what Spielberg has done is great, and I would hope that we would at least have a tribal advisory to Americans who intend to go about the dangers of China. Just quickly on Africa, I just came back from, as Mara and Eritrea and I would, the meeting with President Zayas, who said that he would like to see better relations with the U.S., and met with the Somali Alliance there that are willing to have negotiations in zone of tranquility and humanitarian ceasefire in Somalia, and I would hope that we might, met with Chief Sharif Sheikh Main, who heads that group, if we could put a little bit more diplomatic work in trying to have a solution there in Somalia. I think, though, withdrawal of Ethiopian troops would certainly help, and if we had other AU troops to go in, that would go a long way, I think, and would clear the way. Quickly about Ethiopia-Eritrea decision. 5 years ago, the Border Commission gave bottom aid to Eritrea, and I would hope that we would once again urge Ethiopia to abide by the Borders Commission decision. Finally, on Chad and Sudan, I would hope that we would once again tell Bashir in Sudan that they have to stop destabilizing Africa as they have sent troops, supported the rebels in Chad. Just finally, one thing that Ban Ki-moon asked, the only one thing that when he came before our committee the first time is this: just please give him the support he needs for peacekeeping. Each of the instances, we are cutting the amount. Manuk, 211 requested, 316 needed, we're going to do 211. In Darfur, 550 needed, we're going to do 414. In Chad, virtually nothing, maybe 40 million at most. I would hope that we could somehow look at supporting the new Secretary General who we supported very much in becoming Secretary General, but to at least give him what he needs to do the peacekeeping. Thank you.
Thank you. If I may just on a couple of points. I recently traveled to Addis Ababa to have meetings at the AU about several cases, including Somalia. I met there with the Prime Minister of the transitional government. That is a problem that will be helped by peacekeeping forces, and in fact, we've been trying to help them raise peacekeeping forces for Somalia. But of course, it's also going to be helped by a broadening of the transitional government there. I also just want to say on Eritrea and Ethiopia, we want that border to be resolved. It would help a lot. Isaias, as you know, has been very difficult to deal with. I sent our Assistant Secretary to try to meet him, and he refused to see her. Anything that can be done to convince him that it's probably a good idea to talk to the United States would be useful. Finally, on peacekeeping, I did, by the way, see the Foreign Minister of Sudan yesterday. He is SPLM. They are committing and saying that they don't want to have a further situation like we just recently had in Chad. We send the message very strongly that Chad needs to be left stable. And finally, as to peacekeeping, some of this is a matter of cash flow. I think Ban Ki-moon would not say that we have been unwilling or unable to meet our peacekeeping obligations. The United States has been able to do that. We do it in a way that we have to keep the money cash flowing at the right times, but some of it is sometimes funded, for instance, for Darfur through supplemental appropriations. And we're going to try to meet our peacekeeping targets. If I could just ask one thing, I know what the requests are. If we could have those fully funded, then I think we would be able to meet our obligations.
Thank you very much.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Manzullo.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, it's good to see you here this afternoon. On January 28th of this year, President Bush issued an export control directive. This is a package of reforms aimed at improving the licensing of defense items and services. The directive said that the Director of Defense Control, Trade Control, DDTC, at the State Department would get, quote, additional financial resources, and that intelligence support would be made available for the timely adjudication of defense trade licenses, end of quote. According to President's FY 2009 budget, however, no additional staff is requested for DDTC licensing, despite an 8% increase in the number of defense trade licenses submitted to DDTC last year. The very modest amount of additional funding requested for DDTC licensing of $229,000 doesn't even keep up with inflation, yet the rest of the State Department budget request is well over the rate of inflation, in fact a $703 million increase. My question is, how does this budget request for DDTC licensing comport with the President's directive that the funding be made available and increased accordingly?
Well, first let me say the importance of the directive, because ever since I was National Security Advisor, we've been trying to improve the export control flow. It's very important that we not be trying to control things that we shouldn't be trying to control, and that we focus on the high priority items. I believe, and I will get you a full answer in a breakout, but my understanding is that this is to be funded through fees, and that's why it isn't a budget request. But let me get you an answer for the record. I'll write to you.
Thank you. I've given you this question also in a letter that we handed to your aide. Thank you very much.
Gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Thank the gentleman. The gentleman from Florida, Mr. Wexler.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, over the past month, startling revelations have come forward that specifically relate to your conduct prior to 9/11 and in the run-up to the war in Iraq. A recently released study by the nonpartisan Center for Public Integrity revealed that you, along with President Bush and top administration officials, made a total of 935 false public statements in an orchestrated attempt to take this nation to war. Here's a stack of these false statements right here, all 935 of them. This study has found that you, Madam Secretary, made 56 false statements to the American people, where you repeatedly pump up the case that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction and exaggerate the so-called relationship between Iraq and Al-Qaeda. Madam Secretary, can you please tell us, isn't it true that you had intelligence that cast doubt on your repeated claims that Iraq did not have weapons of mass destruction?
No, it's not true, Congressman. With all due respect, I think if you look back at the key judgments of the intelligence estimate about Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, you will see that those judgments supported the views of many intelligence agencies worldwide, the views of the United Nations inspectors, that Iraq must have been hiding something. Our own intelligence estimates said that Iraq had reconstituted its biological weapons program, its chemical weapons program, and the only disagreement was whether or not they had reconstituted their nuclear weapons program, although there were certainly elements, including the CIA, that believed that they were in the process of doing so. Now, Congressman, I take my integrity very seriously, and I did not at any time make a statement that I knew to be false or that I thought to be false in order to pump up anything. Nobody wants to go to war. Saddam Hussein was a threat to this country. We had gone to war against him in 1991. President Clinton had gone to war against him in 1998. We were in a state of war with him. This was a cessation of hostilities, not an armistice, because let us remember that our pilots were actually flying missions, Southern Watch and Northern Watch, and being shot at by his air defenses. And so, I'm sorry, Congressman, because you've questioned my integrity, I ask you to let me respond. Now, we have learned that many of the intelligence assessments were wrong. There have been many, many investigations of that, including Senate Select Intelligence and a number of others. And we have gone to extraordinary lengths to reform our intelligence agencies so that they can make better assessments of situations in which you have non-transparent governments that will not answer the just demands of an international community that had sanctioned and had resolutions against Saddam Hussein several times.
Secretary,
So no, Congressman, at no time did I intend to, or do I believe that I did,
I simply
put
asked,
forward false
Madam
information to the American people.
I simply asked if you had intelligence that was contrary to the intelligence that you reported repeatedly to the American
Congressman,
people that Iraq did have weapons of mass
Congressman,
destruction.
I would suggest that you go back and read the key judgments of 2002. I think that will answer your question.
Yes, the answer to the question, Madam Secretary, is that in fact there were contrary reports. You chose to weigh the reports that
Congressman,
supported your
Congressman,
belief.
no, Congressman,
My
I
point
chose
is,
to use,
Madam Secretary,
Congressman, I chose to use, Congressman, I'm sorry, I'm going to answer this. Congressman, I chose to use what every administration uses, which is the collective wisdom of the intelligence community that is in a national intelligence estimate. I again ask you to go back and read the key judgments from 2002 about the state of Saddam Hussein's weapons programs, and I think you will see that it was the judgment of the intelligence community as a whole that he had reconstituted his biological weapons program, reconstituted his chemical weapons program, and was seeking to do so with his nuclear weapons program, and might do so within a year if he got foreign assistance. That was the collective wisdom of the intelligence community. I will be the first to say that it was not right.
Madam Secretary, unfortunately, the American people were denied the opportunity to hear the other side. You may have rightfully or wrongfully reached your conclusion, but a legitimate question is, why weren't the American people told that there was contrary intelligence?
Congressman, I am sorry. I sat through the briefings for the Congress and for the Senate done by the intelligence community. We were there to provide policy advice, but either George Tenet or John McLaughlin or others gave those briefings. And Congressman, the American people were told what their intelligence community as a whole believed to be the assessment concerning Iraq's programs. I just want to repeat to you that not only was it our intelligence community, there were other intelligence communities that believed the same. If we didn't believe that, it's very strange that we put Iraq under several Security Council resolutions numbering 16 or 17, demanding that Saddam Hussein answer for his weapons of mass destruction programs, that the Resolution 1441, which was a unanimous resolution of the Security Council saying that he had to answer for his weapons of mass destruction programs, I'd be the first to say the intelligence was not right. And we've gone to great lengths to reorganize it so that we can have better intelligence. But to claim, Congressman, that there were other things that we somehow hid from the American people is simply not right.
Well,
The time of the gentleman has expired, and the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Wilson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, I want to wish you well and best wishes. As chairman, we all have benefited from the service of Chairman Tom Lantos, and I'll always cherish the times that he expressed that he was the most optimistic member of Congress. And I know he would want to be here, Madam Secretary, and with your fond comments for him. And I want to thank you for your very successful efforts in protecting American families and by representing our country so well. Additionally, on your most recent visit to Iraq earlier this month, I'd like your assessment as to the political situation there, the executive, legislative, grassroots levels. How do you feel about the developments in Iraq?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I would first make the point that obviously the men and women in uniform and the surge have improved the security situation. It's still fragile, but it's improved. And the Iraqis have taken advantage of that opportunity in several ways. First of all, at the local level, local citizens committees, people who are coming out to defend their communities and their districts against al-Qaeda, against special groups that would terrorize them. The awakening group of Anbar is perhaps the most famous, but there are these committees in the neighborhoods of Baghdad, in the south, and many other places. Those efforts are supported by provincial, local, district councils that are coming alive. We have supported them through our provincial reconstruction teams that are able to get down to the local level and help people to provide for their citizens at a local level. And we're finally even really seeing movement at the national level. I think we know that it has been slower than we would have hoped, but they have passed in the last few months a pension law, an investment law, a de-Baathification Act called Accountability and Justice Reform. Just today, they passed a provincial powers law that should provide a basis for the relationship between the provinces and the center, and also provide the basis on which provincial elections can take place. They also passed a 2008 budget, and they passed an amnesty. So I think they are moving along. It's tough. It's not easy to learn to use politics rather than tyranny and violence, but they've made some progress.
I particularly appreciate you citing the success of our military. I've had 2 sons, Army and Navy, serve in Iraq. I've visited 8 times. As I see the young people who are protecting our country, they are making a difference, and I'm so grateful for the leadership of General David Petraeus. Additionally, I have a great interest in Afghanistan. My former National Guard unit, the 218th Brigade, is led by General Bob Livingston, is leading the effort to train the Afghan National Police. We have 1,600 troops from South Carolina, the largest deployment since World War II of troops from our state. What is your assessment of the activities for the police and Army in Afghanistan?
I think the general assessment, and I was just in Kandahar and in Kabul, the general assessment is that the Army is doing well. I think they're going to increase the number in the Army to maybe as many as 80,000, maybe a little bit more, because the Army is a truly national institution and people believe that it is fighting well. The police are a more difficult matter, and if there's anything that I've learned, whether it's Colombia or Haiti or Liberia or Iraq, the police tend to be harder to form. But I met a really fantastic American one-star general who's working with the International Security Assistance Forces in the South. They have a good new program for police training, mentoring of police, building police stations in communities so that people feel secure. But we're going to have to take a really hard look at how to increase the police capability, because in counterinsurgency, when you clear with Army forces, you need to be able to hold with police forces so that you can then build in reconstruction. So that's the story of the police in Afghanistan. I think we will want to look to make it better, and particularly to make sure that the international efforts to build police are completely coordinated with what is being done by our own forces.
And I appreciate earlier you stated greater emphasis on provincial reconstruction teams, and I've had the opportunity to visit in Khost and Jalalabad. I've seen firsthand wonderful people, USAID, making an effort to help the people of Afghanistan. Thank you again for your leadership, again protecting American families. Thank you.
Thank you.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Delahunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Secretary. I welcome your statement regarding keeping the Congress informed regarding the proposed bilateral agreement, and particularly a reference to full transparency. I think it's important because I believe that the American people deserve to know as much as possible about their future and the relationship between the United States and Iraq as we go forward prospectively. My committee, along with the committee chaired by Mr. Ackerman, have had 3 hearings on the so-called Declaration of Principles signed by President Bush back in November. And on each occasion, we invited a representative of the Department of State. I had sent you a letter and had received no response. So is it safe for me now to conclude that at the next hearing that we will have a representative of the Department of State?
Absolutely.
Thank you. You know, let me go back to that op-ed piece that you penned this morning with Secretary Gates, because I think this is a very, very important issue, because it dictates the future course of the relationship and our responsibilities and concomitant responsibilities on the part of the Iraqi government. You mentioned in that piece that the United States has a number of these status of forces agreement. I also note the use of the term strategic framework agreement, which I'm guessing is somewhat different. I don't want to go into that now, but I can't find a single status of force agreement that confers on the United States military the authority to engage in military action to defend the host country from foreign or internal aggression. And if you can consult with your very able staff and get back to me on that, I would like to have that information, if it exists, made known to myself and to my constituents, and I'm sure the rest of the American people, because I don't know what the agreement is, but it certainly doesn't appear to be a so-called typical SOFA. And let me just conclude with one question, another question. You are very clear, and you stated here unequivocally that there is no binding obligation to act in the common defense in the event of an armed attack on Iraq. Of course, the Declaration of Principles would lead you to another conclusion, not only from foreign aggression, but internal aggression, and that can be the subject of future hearings. But I guess, as I reflect, I guess my key question is, would the proposed agreement, whatever you want to call it, give the United States the right, not the obligation, but the right to defend Iraq from foreign or internal aggression? And if it does, do you conclude that it would confer sufficient legal authority to use military force to defend Iraq from either internal or foreign aggression without congressional authorization?
Well, Congressman, the first point that I'd like to make is about the SOFA point, which is that these SOFAs, I think if you look at them around the world, they're highly tailored to the specific circumstances. And the principal concern here is that our forces be able to continue to operate in Afghanistan or in Iraq after the expiration of the UN Security Council resolution, because whatever we as a country, the next president, whoever decides that they want to do, I think there's an understanding that there are going to be some things that we want our forces to be able to do.
If you would allow me to interrupt.
Yes.
The typical SOFA confers immunity from prosecution by the host country. That's the commonly accepted understanding of the term SOFA, Status of Forces Agreement. And as I look at the 115 countries with which we have these status of force agreements, that's what it's about. It's not about the authority to engage in military combat.
Well, we also have one with Afghanistan that is somewhat different. We also, some of them are really very detailed down to the question about postage and postal
And I
services.
understand all
And
that.
so they're very varied. But the point that I wanted to make to you, Congressman, is that obviously our forces are still operating in Iraq. And we've come to a point at which the Iraqis, I think rightly in asserting their sovereignty, want to move to a more normal relationship. I think we will work with them, and we will continue to brief the Congress and keep you apprised to determine what kinds of protections we need for our forces so that they can do their work there. In terms of whether or not we would be defending at some point or choosing to operate there to defend Iraq from external or internal attack, I think, of course, those are questions of our own national interest and how we would view a particular circumstance at a particular time. And under those
the
circumstances...
likelihood would be, and again, I apologize, but
Yes,
let me
that's all
interrupt you. The next administration could very well have a significantly different
Yes.
definition of national interest than the Bush administration.
Absolutely. And this does not tie the hands of the next president, but it does permit that on December 31st, our forces would not be without protections in Iraq.
And I just,
Let
me
got
just-
over, Mr.
if the chair would just indulge me for one further observation.
I indulge him? Yeah.
I would point out to the secretary, however, that under Order 17 of the CPA, the Coalition Provisional Authority, that conferred immunity on American troops, that still would exist and was swept into the Iraqi Constitution, so that if the mandate expires and American troops are still there, they are protected in terms of any legal responsibility or culpability as far as Iraqi law is concerned.
What we don't want, Congressman, is any uncertainty about the authorities under which our forces are operating. And given that this is a sovereign government, given that the UN Security Council resolution will expire and the Iraqis do not want to extend it, I think going to a normal basis for our troops is extremely important.
The time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Fortenberry.
Mr. Chairman, first let me say thank you for your kind remembrance of Chairman Lantost. He graced our panel with such dignity and eloquence and incisive wit, and clearly had a formidable command of the most intimate details of foreign operations. I as well considered him to be a dear friend and a mentor. He'll be missed. And Madam Secretary, welcome. And I greatly appreciate your perspectives as well on our foreign operations, as well as your dignified responses today. Our foreign assistance programs represent the face of the United States overseas. Their effectiveness, the integrity in which they are implemented, and the values that they convey speak volumes as to who we are as a people. The United States, it's important to note, is the most generous benefactor to the suffering throughout the world. And whether we embrace it and want it or are fatigued by it, the mantle of leadership in world affairs, I believe, falls to our shoulders. In that regard, Madam Secretary, in our previous gathering, we had the opportunity to dialogue on a renewed spirit of diplomacy in the Middle East, a diplomatic surge, if you will, to complement and enhance our security efforts. And I wanted to follow up with you on that. I believe we now have a fledgling opportunity to strengthen new regional security cooperation. I'd like to hear an update on any progress made in that regard and the resources being applied there with the responsible
Yes, thank you.
neighbors in the area.
I do think that we have an opportunity, first of all, with the Gulf states, our longtime allies in the Gulf states. We've had interest there since Franklin Roosevelt, but there's a renewed interest in cooperation, defense cooperation. There are some defense cooperation items before for notification that have been notified to the Congress because given the regional changes, particularly, frankly, the threat of Iran, I think it's important that we make clear that we're going to be a presence in the Gulf and that we're going to help our allies defend themselves. We've also, out of the Iraq engagement, begun to engage Iraq's neighbors through an Iraq's Expanded Neighbors Conference. I will have just accepted the invitation of the Kuwaitis for a meeting of that will take place toward the end of April. It also provides a kind of forum in which these interests can be pursued. And I would finally note that we are working very intensively to make sure that Iraq, Afghanistan, Lebanon, and others have and to a certain extent the Palestinians have the kind of increasing security capability themselves that they can be stabilizing factors in the region, not destabilizing factors. I think the security situation of the United States has the chance to improve for the long run as a result of these efforts.
So they are being formally institutionalized? That's what we spoke about the last time. And I realize it's fledgling at this point.
The Gulf security dialogue is bilateral, and with Bob Gates has been engaging people multilaterally as well. We have the GCC plus Egypt and Jordan, which is another forum. I wouldn't expect anything that looks like too formal an organization, but I do think that what we're providing is intensified bilateral ties and then multilateral fora in which those efforts can be strengthened and supported.
Any projections on potential outcomes there? Timeline?
There's a lot of interest. It's a different region than most places, and I think there's some reluctance to have too formal structures, but I would say that if you think of it as kind of wheel and spokes, we've both intensified those efforts and strengthened our security position and that of our allies.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from New York, Mr. Meeks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to add my word that we will all miss Chairman Lantos, who really did a great service to this country and indeed to the world, and he will be missed. And I know that we'll have the appropriate time to make further statements in that regard. Likewise, Mr. Chairman, I look forward to your chairmanship and look forward to working with you. You are a man who has distinguished himself long ago in this Congress, and now to have you as a chair of this committee and for me to serve on is an honor for me. So I look forward to working with you. Madam Secretary, good day. I want to move to a different region, but before I do, I just wanted to make sure, because I wasn't sure that I heard a answer to one of Mr. Delahunt's questions about whether or not that you feel you had sufficient authority without coming back to the Congress in regards to acting as an ally in Iraq, and as far as using our forces against the Sunnis, etc. So I didn't hear an answer. Maybe it was, but I was wondering if you could just tell us: do you have enough? Do you have authority? Do you have to come back to Congress?
Well, I would just say, Congressman Meeks, of course, we're in the midst right now of military operations in Iraq, and I think the President is going to do, on advice of his commanders, what we need to do to defend ourselves, to defend the interest and the concerns that we have in Iraq, and we are in the midst of an engagement there. I think the questions probably arise as to what would happen in the future, and I don't want to limit any president's authority because, of course, this is a long-standing constitutional issue, but I think you would see that there has been a tradition both with our administration and with others of consultation with Congress about these matters, and I would expect those to continue.
Let me go to now the subject matter that I wanted to go to, another continent. Our neighbors to the south, extremely concerned about South America, Central America, the Caribbean. And I know that in the President's fiscal year 2009 budget, and I'm thankful for the additional 2%, $32 million that are in that budget, after it had been cut for I guess 4 years or so. Not included in that budget, though, and I'm very supportive of Plan Colombia and now with what we're looking to do for Mexico, but that's a substantial part of the budget. And a number of other, that I hear from leaders in South America and in a number of the other countries, is the need to help for social programs and the alleviation of poverty and education and the income inequality. We don't seem to be putting any substantial amount of money in those areas, equivalent to what we put into security and counter narcotics, which is causing some problems. And I'm going to tie this in to another concern of mine, because it seems as though what I'm concerned is that South America becomes divided. And some of that is around who are our friends and who's not our friends, and they're trying to align themselves. And for example, I know it's difficult because of the words that go across the bow between us and Venezuela, Venezuela and us. But it seems as though that Bolivia and Ecuadar are signed on one side, and then we have Colombia and others standing someplace else. I talked to some of my colleagues in Brazil who feel that they're twitched between the two sides. So my question there is, for example, the last elections that they had, where the Venezuelan people decided that they were not going to give President Chavez the opportunity to be president for life. But President Chavez indicated that he would abide by the people's decision, which he did, which seems to me to be some form of democracy that is taking place there, that the Venezuelan people are determined to take a stand when they feel that they have to take a stand. I saw a similar situation when I went to Venezuela at the referendum of his presidency, where people waited in long lines, and I saw democracy actually at work. It may not have been the outcome that we liked, but in fact there was democracy that was taking place, and it seems as though that we missed the opportunity to possibly get some words, to get to a diplomatic position where we can soften, when we do soften words, when we do see democracy taking place. And so I'm wondering, have we missed some opportunities? I mean, particularly given the fact that when there was a coup d'etat, we did in fact acknowledge the coup government at that time, and that wasn't a democratic process. Back in I think it was 2002. So I'm just wondering about the whole stability of South America and our positioning there, and whether we're missing some golden opportunities.
Well, first, Congressman Meeks, thank you for your interest and your continued work there. I know it's been you've been very active. The first point that I'd make is that if you look just at assistance, we've of course doubled foreign assistance to Latin America during this administration. And even if you back out the Merida initiative this year, there's still an increase in assistance to Latin America. So it's not all security assistance. Plan Colombia has been moving with more and more in the way of support to institutions, to justice reform, and less directly to not just to the Army. So I think we've been moving in those directions. I would just make one point, which is if I could do one thing in Latin America, it would be make sure that we get these free trade agreements through. Because Colombia, which was on the precipice of being a failed state in 2000, first with the Clinton administration and then with our administration, we have helped the Colombian people take back their streets. I was just in Medellin, a place that was synonymous. As a matter of fact, Congressman Scott was there with me. It was synonymous with trouble and Pablo Escobar, and it's now a functioning city. And what we need to do is we need to continue to support governments like Colombia as they come out of the horrors. They still have work to do on human rights, on impunity, all of those things, but they're going to be better off with our support, not without it, and they need to be, we need to be clear in that. I believe that if you think about what we've done with our policies in Latin America, the President's made very clear that we don't have a side, that we're on the side of democracy. And it really doesn't matter if you're a government from the left or a government from the right. We have excellent relations with the large state there, Brazil, We have equally good relations with Chile, very good relations with Uruguay, all governments of the left. We have excellent relations with Peru, a government that we would not have thought, and even with a country like Nicaragua, where we have a long history, so to speak, with that government. The Millennium Challenge program that we have in Nicaragua has been popular whether you're a Sandinista mayor or not, because the benefits of that program to the people. So we've tried to stand for not left or right, but for democracy and prosperity, open markets, and social justice. And I'd be the first to say that I think the social justice part of our message has gotten sharper and stronger over the last couple of years, and that has helped us in Latin America. They still have a lot of challenges, but it's a part of the world that's come a long way, and we need to continue to be good partners.
The time of the gentleman has expired. We have about 4 or 5 votes, depending on Republican strategy, coming up. And but perhaps we can get one more question in this round, and I would like to recognize our new member, our new colleague, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a great honor and a privilege to be part of this committee, and I also would like to reflect upon Chairman Lantos's legacy here with this committee. I only knew him for a short time, but he was a man of extensive knowledge in foreign affairs and a deep passion, and I know that we will all miss him. Madam Secretary, since the last time you testified before this committee, Iran had continued to progress in its nuclear program in violation of 2 UN Security Council resolutions. And according to the recent NIE, if Iran continues its enrichment activity, it will likely be able to produce sufficient fissile material or fuel for a weapon by the early part of next decade and a weapon shortly thereafter. What's the current status of the UNSC resolution on Iraq, and what's included in the resolution, and what do we expect our allies to do once the resolution is passed?
Thank you. Well, I recently in Berlin a couple of weeks ago, the 6 parties, Germany plus the P5, came to agreement on the elements of a resolution. That resolution is now being put together and debated and shared with broader in the Security Council, and I would hope that within a few weeks at least we would be able to get a vote, an affirmative vote. I do think that these Security Council resolutions, they're not as strong as the United States would like, but they have the effect of reminding Iran that it's isolated from the international community. In this case, as Congresswoman Ross-Layton mentioned, this one has a new provision on cargo inspection, which we think could be very important. Again, it's not as strong as we would want, but it opens a new direction, which would be very important. It also deepens some of the sanctions on asset freezes and the like. We have also been able to use measures outside of the Security Council, whether they are the Treasury 311s that prevent the Iranians from using the international financial system for ill-gotten gains. That's why we designated the IRGC, designated the Quds Force. We're going after their finances. We're going to keep going after their finances. And we want our friends around the world to be more aggressive on that side. I frankly think that the immediate aftermath of the NIE was to cause people to relax a little too much, but as Director McConnell said, that should never have been the reading of the NIE, because the piece of this that's really dangerous is the enrichment and reprocessing activity, and I think we've gotten people gathered again around that recognition, and we'll continue to pursue this. There is some evidence that the isolation is starting to have an effect. We're not looking for moderates in Iran. We're looking for reasonable people that may not want to be isolated, and we'll continue to pursue these policies to try to achieve that.
I think the gentleman's time has expired. Committee will now recess. We will find you a place to do your business, because this could be a 30 to 40-minute stretch, and then we will come back for the remaining members who wish to question you. Mr. Sherman would be the first person to be recognized.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam.
The second round?
And the committee will be in recess.
I mean, obviously, after